Bad Bunny is headlining the Super Bowl this year, which is super exciting. He's an incredible performer, literally one of the biggest stars in the world right now. And I think the vast majority of us are reacting with joy, with anticipation. However, if you are virulently racist, pro-ICE, and/or MAGA, the Venn diagram for all three are basically just overlapping circles at this point, then you're probably not so happy. In this episode, we are discussing the long and robust history of Black athletes and performers using their platforms to make bold political statements. And this feels like a very appropriate time to have this conversation because the Super Bowl is just around the corner. It's coming up Sunday, February 8th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, streaming on NBC and taking place this year at the Levi Stadium in Santa Clara, California. But I think for me what's actually really interesting about the NFL is the politics behind this organization. I think a lot of people sit down for Super Bowl Sunday and games throughout the year and don't necessarily think about how it came to be in its current iteration. That at a certain point, Black athletes weren't allowed into the NFL at all. That this organization claims to not be political and yet keeps making political choices. Like who gets fined for certain behaviors, who doesn't get fined for certain behaviors and why, who gets celebrated, who gets ignored. Even this conversation about the presence of ICE at the upcoming Super Bowl. Back in September 2025, you likely saw that Bad Bunny is headlining the Super Bowl this year, which is super exciting. He's an incredible performer, literally one of the biggest stars in the world right now. And I think the vast majority of us are reacting with joy, with anticipation. However, if you are virulently racist, pro-ICE, and/or MAGA, the Venn diagram for all three are basically just overlapping circles at this point, then you're probably not so happy. In addition to, putting ICE in that space and creating terror and discomfort and fear around an event that should be joyful and exciting for those who attend, they've also made some pretty explicit comments and decisions. First example I have here is Trump calling the decision to have Bad Bunny headline, quote, absolutely ridiculous. Isn't that wild? Like the President of the United States of America is spending his precious time commenting on a headliner that he probably doesn't know anything about. You think Trump has ever listened to a single Bad Bunny song his entire life? Man, he doesn't know who that is. Someone on his shoulder probably just said, this guy speaks Spanish. And you're xenophobic, so you should say this is absolutely ridiculous. And then that's what Trump did. This next one is a doozy. So remember when we had that government shutdown that lasted 43 days and was the longest government shutdown in US history? Yeah, so in the middle of that, Mike Johnson also weighed in on the fact that Bad Bunny is the headliner. He said it was a, quote, terrible decision, and he, quote, didn't even know who Bad Bunny was. So these people don't even know who this guy is, but they're just saying it's a terrible decision because the people in their periphery are saying that this individual does not align with their political worldview. But you know who Mike Johnson suggested instead of Bad Bunny? An 82-year-old 1980s country singer, Lee Greenwood. He said he thinks Lee Greenwood would be a better example for all the millions of children who will be watching. Man, you say you don't know who Bad Bunny is. Who is Lee Greenwood? There's a generational, racialized divide going on here. I have no idea who you're talking about. And Turning Point USA is so frustrated by this headliner decision that they actually created their own counter program called the All-American Halftime Show. Now, as of the filming of this episode, they have not announced who they're going to include in that halftime show yet, but they have named explicitly that all the singers will be singing in English and they'll be promoting good American values that they want your kids to see. Which is hilarious because Bad Bunny is literally American. Or did y'all forget that Puerto Rico is a part of the United States? Like, some of them see anything that's not white and not English speaking and automatically it's foreign. And it's like, did you forget that this is a nation of immigrants? Did you forget the whole melting pot analogy? Where did that go, right? This guy named Corey Lewandowski, who's a senior advisor for the Trump regime, went on the Bunny show and said that, quote, ICE will have enforcement at the Super Bowl for the Bad Bunny Super Bowl halftime. Chrissy Noam then also went on that show and said that ICE will be, quote, all over the 2026 Super Bowl. You know that post that Issa Rae put on X a lifetime ago where it just has an asterisk, deep Negro spiritual sigh? Like, it's not funny. That's how I feel. I think I'm laughing so I don't cry, because this is so deeply sinister. I want to point out to you that in Corey's comment, he specifically said they will have enforcement at the Super Bowl for the Bad Bunny Super Bowl halftime. They are specifically targeting Bad Bunny, and that is not by accident. His songs are in Spanish. A huge portion of his base are folks who are Latine. And we know that ICE is absolutely targeting Latine and Hispanic communities right now. And this is also deeply unfair to Bad Bunny, right? This is a huge opportunity to be able to perform for the Super Bowl halftime show that's major. But instead of just being able to focus on giving the best performance of his life, there's also now this like undercurrent of fear around making sure that his fans are safe. Or folks opting out and not going altogether for fear of being targeted, which is real. You know, I live in Chicago and ICE operations here have been on 10. I think we're very fortunate in that our governor and our mayor and the vast majority of our governmental leadership are very anti-ICE. We're very clear in their pushback against Trump that they're not just gonna get to walk all over Chicago. And Chicagoans came with the knuck if you buck energy. You know, I personally went to the Broadview Detention Center a couple of times to protest their holding of people in horrific, terrible conditions. Vast majority of people have no criminal records, no impetus, no reason, no rationale to be targeting folks in this way. But that's how this organization operates. There's a lot of interesting conversation online right now about whether or not ICE is, you know, more similar to slave patrols than they are the Gestapo and vice versa. And my take on that is that ICE is an entity created to implement law and order. And in the United States, law and order means a white supremacist status quo. Let's just call it what it is. There are many ways in which the way ICE is moving emulates slave patrols. There are also many ways in which ICE is moving that emulates the Gestapo. Ultimately, slave patrols and the Gestapo are manifestations of fascism. One is homegrown and one is from Germany. And something else that we don't talk about enough is the cross-pollination that happened there, even historically. This is a little bit of a tangent, but if you want to rock with me on this, you know, I'm Black and Jewish. I know a lot about sort of Black and Jewish histories and relationality. And we know from historical record that the Nuremberg laws that codified racial theories of Aryan supremacy in the context of Nazi Germany, they studied the brutality of the US government against Black people. They studied our race laws and anti-miscegenation laws and so on and so forth, and transliterated those to their particular context to subjugate Jewish people. So all this to say, these are a lot of different ways of calling ICE what they are: fascists. Emulations of fascism. And I think for me, living in Chicago and having a front row seat to all of this has been radicalizing in a very real way. What we're seeing happen in Minnesota right now, right? Renee Good was shot dead, murdered in cold blood by an ICE agent as she was turning her car to drive away. What else do you call that if not fascism? And my heart goes out to Minnesotans right now who are really not so far from us here in Illinois, who are protesting in the streets, who are pushing back against this entity that frankly needs to be abolished. Every day we're seeing news stories of the horrors that this organization that was just founded in the early 2000s is raining down on our communities. A story just broke this week about a young boy, literally 5 years old, being arrested by ICE. Explain that to me. Explain it to me like I'm 5, because it wouldn't make sense then and it doesn't make sense now. Let's also be honest about the fact that specifically, you know, Kristi Noem wanting ICE to be at the Super Bowl, some of this is about personal retaliation because Bad Bunny has been and continues to be extremely outspoken. He is a Puerto Rican man. He has spoken out in favor of Puerto Rican independence. He has also spoken out against the Trump regime's immigration policies, to such an extent that he actually canceled his stops in the US for his most recent tour for fear that the Trump regime would target his concerts, his gatherings, for these ICE raids. And now we see that that fear was far from unfounded. It was rooted in truth, because what are they doing now? Targeting his Super Bowl performance for an ICE raid. Also, this hyperfixation on the fact that he is singing in Spanish, as if there aren't literally hundreds of languages spoken in this country alone, is bizarre. And to me, it really underlines the phenomenon of American exceptionalism. You know, like when you travel somewhere internationally and you encounter, you know, someone who comes from the United States, and there's almost this like expectation that everyone around them, even if they're in a country where English is not one of the native languages, that they'll be catered to, that the people around them will speak English for their comfort. That is a product of American exceptionalism. Also, the presumption that to love a nation means to be uncritical of a nation is ridiculous. The things that we love the most, we are compelled to critique the most deeply. If you want something to improve, you have to be willing to interrogate it, mold it, move it, shift it, reimagine it constantly. And to me, MAGA isn't about that. It's not about world building and making the country better. It's about returning to what we know doesn't work. Deeply entrenched, white supremacist informed racial hierarchy. It doesn't work. The NFL says it doesn't do politics, and yet it is constantly making political decisions. Recently, the NFL fined Houston, Texas linebacker Azeez El-Shaair for wearing "Stop the Genocide" on his eye black. The fine was for $11,593. I feel like it's important to note in this story that Azeez is a Black and Muslim man who has been very outspoken about Palestinian causes. Now, the NFL does have a rule that putting personal messages like this on gear that's, visible during the game is not allowed, and it has to be approved if someone wants to do that. But other people have violated this rule in the past and not necessarily experienced the same kinds of consequences. Demario Davis's example, he wore a headband that said "Man of God." He was supposed to be fined $7,000, but was able to appeal the decision and subsequently raised $30,000 by selling those headbands online and then donated the proceeds to a hospital in Mississippi, which is pretty cool. The NFL responded by saying that sometimes they will rescind these fines when the player understands why it was implemented in the first place and agrees not to do something like that in the future. But I do find it very peculiar which situations are forgiven and smoothed over and which ones are not. And all of those decisions are inherently political. And that's why I'm always saying the personal is political and the political is personal. There's not a single thing that transpires in the world that is not touched by politics. There's this quote by Pericles where he says, just because you don't take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. Even organizations that claim to be apolitical oftentimes have deeply political histories that brought them to the present moment and continue to make deeply political choices as it pertains to their players and leagues and associations. Do you think politics has a role or place in the NFL? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the chat and in the comments. And after you're done watching this episode, make sure you make your way to blavity.com to see what else we got cooking up. Let's jump into some of the histories of the NFL, the MLB, and these various associations and leagues that we love and enjoy today, but have, you guessed it, deeply racist histories. It's interesting because more than 65% of NFL players today are Black, so it's pretty hard to imagine that at a certain point we were barred from the NFL entirely. Jim Crow laws persisted well into the 1960s, but the NFL actually integrated in 1946 due to the efforts of 4 men who very rarely get their flowers. So I want to give them their flowers today. Interestingly, the first Black man who played in the NFL was this guy named Fritz Pollard, and he played in the league in 1920, which is when the NFL was created. And in the early 1930s, a handful of Black folks actually played in the league, about 17. But that all changed when this guy named George Preston Marshall, who at the time was the owner of the Washington Redskins, pushed for Black people to be excluded from the league. NFL owners ended up creating this gentleman's agreement that effectively barred all Black players from playing in the league. But that all changed again in 1946 when Kenny Washington and Woody Strode signed with the LA Rams. But that only happened after the Los Angeles Coliseum threatened to expel the team, to evict them, unless they brought on Black players. When these two joined the team, they ended that prior NFL gentleman's agreement that had previously barred Black people from the league. So that's a win. Bill Willis and Marion Motley also made history in 1946 when they joined the Cleveland Browns. They made history as the first Black people to play in the All-America Football Conference. And years later, they were both elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It should come as no surprise, given the anti-Indigenous bent of the name of this team, that the Washington Redskins were actually the last team in the NFL to integrate. They waited until 1962. But as you can imagine, the NFL was not the only league or sport to go through this process of integration. So I definitely want to give you a brief overview in history of some of the other ways that this is played out in tennis, boxing, etc. Major League Baseball was segregated starting all the way back in the 1880s with another gentleman's agreement. Which, side note, what is up with all these gentleman's agreements? I don't think it's very gentlemanly to be the progenitor for decades of exclusion, subjugation, and segregation. For decades, Black folks were relegated to the Negro Leagues, who would often play in the same fields, but at different times. Jackie Robinson broke that MLB color line when he started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. He went on to win Rookie of the Year that same year, MVP in 1949, and in 1962 became the first Black person inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. The NBA has a very similar history. In 1946, it formed as an all-white league and didn't admit its first Black player until 1950. And full integration didn't end up happening until the 60s. Chuck Cooper was the first Black person drafted to an NBA team, the Boston Celtics. Nat Clifton was the first Black person to sign an NBA contract in general. And Earl Lloyd was the first Black person to play in an NBA game. Today, nearly 80% of NBA players are Black. And I think for me, what's so astounding is the level of Black excellence that has proliferated in these spaces. To go from literally being entirely excluded to comprising 65, 80% of an entire league, an entire association, is very impressive, if I do say so myself. Thus far, we've been discussing the many Black men who broke glass ceilings, but that's not to say that Black women haven't had our mark too, because we absolutely have. Althea Gibson was the first Black person to play at Wimbledon in 1951. And in 1956, she became the first Black person to ever win the Grand Slam title in tennis history. Because of her triumphs, she carved a path for the likes of Serena and Venus Williams to come behind her and make a mark for themselves. And with this particular story, it feels important to name a woman by the name of Alice Marble, who played a sizable role in opening some of these doors in the tennis world. Alice Marble was an 18-time Grand Slam champion who used her privilege as a white woman to call out the hypocrisy of the tennis world. In American Tennis Magazine, she wrote, quote, "If tennis is a game for ladies and gentlemen, it's also time we acted a little more like gentle people and less like sanctimonious hypocrites. If Althea Gibson represents a challenge to the present crop of women players, it's only fair that they should meet that challenge on the courts." I think examples and inflection points like this really remind me of the importance of not allyship, but accompliceship. Throughout time and space, folks who sit in positions of privilege, putting that privilege on the line, using that privilege, mobilizing that privilege to disrupt a status quo that doesn't hold all of us has been deeply important. Allyship and accomplishship are not the same. And me personally, I'm always looking for accomplices. Across time and space, Black athletes have taken up deeply political stances. Let's talk about some of those moments. I want to start with Muhammad Ali. In addition to becoming heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali was also an ardent supporter of racial justice. He was friends with Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and he even resisted the draft for the Vietnam War, which became a huge iconic moment for the anti-war movement. And he did all of this guided by his faith in Islam. On September 1st, 2016, 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick knelt down on one knee in protest of police brutality. He even sat down during the national anthem for several games, which, as you know, is not customary. But he justified it by saying that, quote, "I am not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people and people of color." His acts of protest ultimately culminated in him being blackballed from the NFL. And I think that goes to show that there is a heavy price that Black athletes often pay when they refuse to go along to get along. And certainly you've seen the famous photo of Tommy Smith and John Carlos doing the Black Power salute at the 1986 Mexico City Olympics. We've spent a lot of time talking about the halftime show and all this energy and focus that's going towards it, but I don't think a lot of people know that the halftime show wasn't always what it is today. It wasn't until Michael Jackson headlined the 1993 Super Bowl that the NFL realized bringing in these mega stars brought way more eyes to their broadcasts. Ever since, Black artists have been prominently featured in halftime shows. Kendrick Lamar, SZA, Usher, Rihanna, Beyonce, Prince, Janet Jackson, and the list goes on. And now, Bad Bunny. You know, I just have to say it, Black folks show time and time again that we are the cultural curators and trendsetters, man. Like, it's actually really cool. And since we started this episode with Bad Bunny, it feels appropriate to end it with him too. He recently released his official trailer for the Super Bowl halftime show, and I'm a big fan. It's a great video. Let's watch a bit of it. What I really appreciate about this video is that it is a melting pot of people. You know, it's people with all different skin tones, hair textures, optics, adornments, coming together and dancing with him. And to me, the message feels very clear. Everyone is welcome to partake in the joy of sharing music, in the joy of sharing dance. And I think that's a really beautiful message to put out into the world in the wake of MAGA infusing all this divisiveness and discouragement around his performance. Because after all, one of the best antidotes to that kind of energy is celebration and unity. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of Blavity Town Hall. Be sure to comment. Let us know what you're thinking about the series, if you're enjoying it. If you haven't seen the first episode, make sure you go back and watch, and subscribe and turn on your notification bell if you haven't already so you can keep up with all of our latest drops. Bye!